Well, good morning again, church. So we are in a week 2 of a 3-week sermon series on the book of Revelation. And as I said last week, this is because a few years ago, I made the strategic error of asking you what you wanted to hear me preach on. And I have been avoiding it as long as I can. And now in these final 3 weeks, I wanted to make good on your request to hear something about Revelation. And I talked a little bit about this last week, but let me reiterate. I think part of why I had avoided this for so long, 20 odd years of ministry and doing a sermon series on Revelation, was because, probably for the same reason that many of you said you wanted to hear about this book, which is it's confusing. The parts that I had dabbled in before were bizarre or troubling, and I just felt ill-equipped to do a sermon series on this. So the approach we took before is about a year and a half ago. We did a month-long series on it, and that helped me, and I dove in and I became more familiar with the book. But as I said last week, part of what happened over the course of learning more about this mysterious book is that I began to see the hope in it. And I saw all the messiness and all the confusing parts and all the symbolism and all the confusion, but I recognized that it was moving to a place of hope. And in many ways, I felt like that would be a fitting way to end my time with all of you at Grace, because honestly, it feels like a lot of life, doesn't it? It feels like there's a whole lot of messiness, but moving toward a place of greater hope. That's a message of faith that I think, that God meets us and that Christ comes to us in the chaos and the challenges and the difficulty and the struggle of life and helps us move into a place of knowing that there is a better future, that there is more ahead, that these present challenges and trials are only temporary. I think it's symbolic of at least how I envision my 6 years at this church. Starting off, I mean, you may not remember this. Many of us try to forget it, but we were worshiping on a gross, humid, tropical-like day like this when I first arrived in the parking lot because we were wearing masks outside every other parking stall, chalked off in the corner early in the morning so that we could do this before it got too hot. And that felt very chaotic, very uncertain, very messy way of trying to be the church and the community and start something together. And we have moved into something that feels like stability and greater hope. And I have incredible hope and dreams and expectations for where this congregation is headed in the future. And I think that is an exciting thing. So what I want to talk a little bit about today is if Revelation is meant to be a particular vision that Jesus put on the heart of a guy named John of Patmos, and John is trying to understand this vision, and he is repeating this vision that he has had, and he is writing it in the form of a letter to 7 different churches in Asia Minor, present-day Turkey and Anatolia area. So he's writing this message that he says, Jesus has given me this vision, I'm going to record it, and I'm going to share it with 7 churches. And it's going to be a message that at one time is going to be about pushing the churches, like Amanda was talking to the children about, pushing them to be what they are capable of being, challenging them where they need to be nudged or prodded a little bit. And also, I want to tell you about this grand vision that God has in store for humanity, and that we are moving into a place that is going to feel like the temporary unsettledness, restlessness, anxiety that we have now will give way to a better future ahead. And that's really where this message is going. And so last week we talked a little bit about what Revelation is not and what it is. Today I want to dig deeper and kind of go under the surface a little bit about let's strip away some of the unusual kind of symbolism. The Lamb opening the seals on the scroll and the lampstands and all of this very kind of confusing imagery. And let's get at what is at the heart of the message to the churches and what might be our takeaway in 2026 for this message that was delivered in the first century to 7 Christian congregations. All right, there are these churches, and each one is addressed one at a time. And today, Andrew read to us particularly about the message that was delivered to the church in Laodicea. And we'll be talking about that again in just a few moments. But the churches are struggling with usually one of 2 things that are going on. The first one is that this is a warning about the persecution that they are facing or that they are likely to face. Now, persecution in the church is a very real thing, and it's still a thing that is very much at work today. However, I would not say that this is a huge problem for the North American church, right? Because we find ourselves in a culture that is at least somewhat accepting of our faith tradition. Many people, if not most people, claim to at least believe in God or in the God that we claim to believe in, right? There is still something of, certainly there are times that it feels like there are individuals or groups that are hostile to the Christian message, but we are not, generally speaking, a persecuted people today. Now, some people will bring that up and talk about it like they are, but not in the sense like Christians have been throughout the centuries. Not in the sense that we have to worship in secrecy. Not that we ever gather for fear of our own life, right? That is not the kind of persecution that we experience today. That is way more the case of the early church. Remember that one of the things that has happened just prior to the time of Revelation being written is that the Roman Empire and the Roman authorities, particularly some emperors more so than others, but had a very negative impression of Christianity, and Christians were burned at the stake or tortured or shamed or humiliated or executed publicly for their beliefs, for their faith. And so the Christian movement went, in some cases, literally underground to try to avoid that persecution. So that is not what we are experiencing today, right? Now, there'll be a story that pops up, and it's going to feel more like a culture wars type of stuff than it will be a genuine form of persecution. Every once in a while, you're going to hear from somebody that says, I'm not allowed to lead public prayer in my workplace, right? And I'm persecuted. Well, it's not exactly the same as being impaled, right? And so I think we can appreciate the difference there. And so it's not that persecution isn't real. I just don't think that is our primary concern today. What I do think that the larger message that Revelation is warning against is something that is called accommodation. And accommodation is the idea that there are parts of the larger secular society, oftentimes having to do with the empire or a particular kind of large movement that we might be a part of, like a government or a cultural system and so forth, and that those systems oftentimes cause us to become a little bit too comfortable with accommodation and accommodating some of those secular cultural practices. So let me give you some examples. So in the first century now, when this letter is written, there are people that are living in places like we've talked about before, like Corinth or Ephesus, for example. Places that are centers of the imperial cult or widespread pagan worship, or they become kind of Wild West outpost kind of places. And people there who are part of the Christian movement are struggling because they find themselves being sucked into some of the local practices, whether that's around temple prostitution or whether that's around eating meat that was previously designated as a sacrifice to an idol, those kinds of things. And people are struggling with that, and those are the real challenges that some of the folks at this time are facing. Or is it that when push comes to shove and when you are under the threat of the Roman emperor and you are told to bow down to worship their God and you refuse to do so, the stakes are high? Or are you tempted to do that and pretend that you are a part of that culture and that belief system when it benefits you economically, but privately you'll do something else, right? And so that's the idea of accommodation. It's the slipping into these things where the lines are a little bit more blurry. And we talk about that too, and where that often comes up in the church today is, again, where people generally say, well, if you allow this, then it'll lead to that, right? It's the slippery slope argument. And so you'll hear things like, well, if we have a same-sex wedding, then what's to prevent then from people marrying their pets, right? Like, you heard that kind of crazy way of thinking. But that's the way that accommodationist kind of concerns come about, right? When you hear somebody make a case that if this is allowed to happen, then blah, 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 right? And it's like a scare tactic, okay? So we see this sometimes in the church today when people are making those kind of arguments, but I don't think that what Jesus is talking about in Revelation is that. I think it's something that is far less obvious to us. I think it's something that sometimes is just under the surface, and it is very sneaky in the way that it captures us. And what I'm talking about is the kind of things that we see as injustices, as oppression, and as things that are dehumanizing to other people that start off slowly and intensify, and by the time we're aware of it, we're already a little bit too far deep into the problem and before we recognize it, okay? So in that sense, it's something that sneaks up on us. And so, for example, you can probably call to mind any number of things that feel like, this feels like a problem in the world today, but what do we do about it now because it seems too big to take on? The challenge is too great. Or we say, well, maybe we should just be patient and maybe this will begin to fix itself. Or surely this is just a phase and it won't last forever. I want to read to you something that addresses this. This is a letter that addresses this very thing. It says, the contemporary church is so often a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. It is so often the arch supporter of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's often vocal sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If the church of today does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authentic ring, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for this century. I meet young people every day whose disappointment with the church has risen to outright disgust. I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this divisive hour, and this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. Strong words, right? Written by Martin Luther King Jr. from a Birmingham jail cell to the Christian and Jewish leaders of Birmingham. Those words feel pretty timely, don't they? I mean, in some ways, that indictment feels probably as fresh as it did the day that it was written. That's the accommodation that I think is the true warning that is being issued in the book of Revelation to the churches, right? It's if you become so meh about the concerns of injustice that we see around us, and we become complacent about it, or we turn a blind eye to it, then what witness does the church actually have to the world? Where are we actually sharing a message of hope to the oppressed and to the downtrodden and to the marginalized if, when the moment arrives for us to take a bold stand, we say, that feels risky, or I don't really want to get involved, or I'm not sure how I would make an impact with that. And I think that that is the way that it sneaks up on us. This isn't about a slippery slope argument. This is the kind of daily stuff that we are called to struggle with as people of faith all the time. The church in Laodicea is unique in that they are the one that is called lukewarm. It's a church that apparently has people who are very committed, at least in theory, to the message of Jesus. And these are people that are probably pretty well educated. They have some financial means, and they basically are running the risk now of feeling like, I don't know, how much do we really need Jesus if we can care for ourselves in a satisfactory kind of way? But as Amanda so beautifully told the children, this letter in some respects serves as the coach, whose job is to say, yeah, okay, but I want to push you to do better. I know that you are capable of more. How are you going to move to the next thing? How are you going to address the next thing that comes your way? You can never be content with the way that things are now, and that certainly is the case, as a coach would tell you, but it's also the case with the church today. And my concern with the North American church is that because persecution isn't the number one threat to us, and because some of these things that people make a big deal about in the culture wars are really not our biggest concern, the biggest concern is, are we ineffective in our public witness when we do not do what we are called to do, which is work towards justice, when we are not loving God and loving our neighbor as we are supposed to do? This is where I think the rubber meets the road with our faith. And this is where, if we strip away some of the creatures and the symbolism and the confusion and the bizarreness of Revelation, I think we see right through it, and we see into this place that the warning to the churches is, if you become too comfortable with the status quo, there is danger in that as well. Now, here's the good news. This is not where the book stops. The letter continues. And this letter isn't hate mail. This is actually a love letter. Because Jesus cares enough for his church to say, I see the way that you have been heading, and I want to redirect you. I want to encourage you to do better. I want you to look at the systems of oppression and injustice in the world around you, and I want you to speak up. I want you to have the courage. I want you to be bold. I want you to take a stand. And as soon as you become too comfortable with it, that's where we're going to have our problems. But I am calling you to be something different. You have chosen to be my followers, not to enter into a more comfortable place, but instead to stand on the side of the oppressed and the persecuted and the marginalized, and to say, I know that my number one purpose in life is to love God and love neighbor. And that is where he is leading us as a church. Now, I'm proud that this church has been willing to talk about difficult things. And I'm proud that this church has been a church that has desired to follow Scripture, but also to be very inclusive. I'm glad that this church is a place that people are deeply committed in their faith and continue to practice their faith and take a stand and to be bold and to show courage. And I'm proud of what this church is. And I know that we are not called to say that we have arrived. But there is more to do. There is another chapter to be written, and there will be another one after that. But I'm so grateful to have been with you on this journey, to get to this place, and to be a part of a church that I am proud to serve, to be a part of a community that I am grateful to be a part of, to be at a place where I have benefited and been blessed to help this community be a part of raising my children. This is a place that embodies our values, and yet I know that we are called for more and more great days ahead. So as we listen to this love letter from the church, it is not just a scolding, it is not a telling off, it is a corrective action. It is a repent or a pivot that says, I see what you are able to do, and you've made it this far, and that's great. But do not settle. Do not become lukewarm. Instead, push ahead. Continue in this message of hope, working for justice, bringing together communities of people, bringing them under the banner of Christ. And together we will work to help create this new city. And I'm thankful that in some small way, we get to be a part of that solution as Grace United Methodist Church. Let's pray.